From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report. The United Nations Environment Program says 200 million Africans go to sleep hungry. That number represents 23% of the population on the continent. A new UN study shows that 8 out of 10 countries facing the worst food shortages are in Africa. Recently, African experts, farmers, and others gathered in Kenya for 2 days of discussion. They debated ways to feed the growing human population in Africa and deal with rising temperatures on Earth's surface. The UN's climate change coordinator for Africa, Richard Muneng, was one of the speakers. He noted a need to increase food production to feed the population. But, he said, it is important to find ways to feed people without destroying forests, rivers, and seas that provide food. At the meetings, Emmanuel Dlamini served as a negotiator for One Africa, a group that fights extreme poverty in Africa. In his opinion, climate change is here to stay. He says African governments and farmers have to look for ways to deal with the changes. Most African countries depend on rain to prepare their farmland and to start growing crops. For the past few years, a lack of rainfall has affected several countries, making their populations dependent on food aid. African farmers say that a combination of unpredictable rain and rising temperatures creates an environment for crop diseases that affects production. The conference also heard from a representative of Nestle, one of the world's largest food companies. Nestle Africa's Hans Jor says farmers need assistance from food processing companies and non-governmental organizations. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization says deforestation has decreased over the past 10 years. But it still continues at a high rate in many countries. Deforestation is mainly caused by the cutting down of tropical forests to provide land for agriculture. The world's total forest area is just over 4 billion hectares. About 13 million hectares of forest were cut down or lost through natural causes each year in the last 10 years. This compares with about 16 million hectares per year during the 1990s. The FAO study covers 233 countries and areas. The study found that Brazil and Indonesia have reduced their deforestation rates. The two countries had the highest loss of forests in the 1990s. In addition, the study noted tree planting programs in countries such as China, India, Vietnam, and the United States. These programs, along with natural expansion of forests in some areas, have added more than 7 million hectares of new forests each year. South America and Africa had the highest yearly loss of forests during the last 10 years. South America lost 4 million hectares. Africa lost almost 3.5 million hectares. However, Asia gained more than 2 million hectares a year in the last decade. In North America and Central America, the forest area remained about the same. In Europe, it continued to expand, but at a slower rate than earlier. Eduardo Rojas is Assistant Director General of FAO's Forestry Department. He said for the first time, the rate of deforestation has decreased around the world. This is the result of efforts taken at local and international levels. Mr. Rojas said countries have improved their forest policies and legislation. They have also provided forests for use by local communities and native peoples, and for the protection of biological diversity. He said this is a welcome message in 2010, the International Year of Biodiversity. However, Mr. Rojas said the rate of deforestation is still very high in many areas. He said countries must strengthen their efforts to better protect and manage their forests. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. You can find transcripts, MP3s, podcasts, and captioned videos at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report. Cassava is a very important crop in many countries. More than 160 million people across Africa depend on the plant for food or to earn money. The continent produces 60% of the world's cassava. In May, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reported that cassava production had increased by 60% worldwide since 2000. Agriculture experts had been expecting world cassava production to grow even more during the next 10 years. But those expectations have been crushed. Plant diseases are attacking cassava crops in East and Central Africa. Two diseases are the cassava brown streak virus and the cassava mosaic virus. The Food and Agriculture Organization says brown streak disease does more damage since it affects the root of the crop. Luca Alanovi is the acting director of the FAO in East and Central Africa. He says the agency has taken steps to improve the situation, but the problem is not getting better. He says decisions on how to handle the problem will have a huge impact on the food security of people in Central Africa. Dominique Devou heads the European Union Rural Development and Agricultural Program in Kenya. She says the cassava diseases have changed over the years. She says early research slowed the disease, but the disease changed form and new research is needed. The FAO says at least $100 million is needed to study the diseases and support clean farm production. Experts say failure to stop the disease means cassava disease will likely invade Nigeria the biggest producer of cassava in Africa. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Has anyone ever tried to get your goat? To get your goat is an expression. It means to make you mad. A good friend might tell you, "Don't worry about what that person said. He was just trying to get your goat." But there are plenty of good reasons to get a goat, and not just for milk or meat. The animals can help control weeds. They can be friendly with children and adults. And they can make money with their hair. Cashmere goats produce cashmere. Angora goats produce, no, not Angora. Angora fiber comes from rabbits. Angora goats produce mohair. Mohair is used to make clothing, carpets, and other products. The goats came from the Anatolian plains. Their name comes from the Turkish city of Ankara. The Mohair Council of America says the first Angora goats arrived in the United States in 1849. 7 females and 2 males were imported. Today, the United States is one of the world's leading producers of mohair. The other top sources are South Africa and Turkey. 90% of the mohair from the United States comes from Texas. An adult Angora can produce as much as 7 kilograms of hair each year. The value of the coat depends on the age, size, and condition of the goat. As Angoras get older, their hair becomes thicker and less valuable. The goats need their mother's milk for the first 3 or 4 months. They reach full maturity at about 2 years. But even then, they are smaller than most sheep and milk goats. Cashmere goats are usually larger than Angoras. Cashmere goats can grow big enough to be kept with sheep and cattle. The outer hair of the animal is called guard hair. Behind it is the valuable material on a cashmere goat. Some farmers just comb their cashmere goats to remove the hair. But if the goats do get a haircut, it often happens that when they would naturally lose their winter coat between December and March. Angora goats generally get their hair cut twice a year, in the spring and fall. Owners do it themselves or hire a professional shearer. An Angora without a coat can get cold, so the sheared goat may need to be kept extra warm for about a month after shearing. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. To read, listen, and learn English with our stories about agriculture and other topics, go to voaspecialenglish.com. You can also find captioned videos of our programs at the VOA Learning English channel on YouTube.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Years ago, a young forester took an unusual new job. Earl Cooley became one of the first smoke jumpers. Smoke jumpers parachute from airplanes. They fight fires that crews cannot reach quickly or easily from the ground. Earl Cooley worked for the United States Forest Service, an agency of the Agriculture Department. The Forest Service had a plane that it wanted to use to drop water bombs onto wildfires. But that idea failed. So the agency decided to use the plane for what was then a new practice: smoke jumping. The first fire jump in the United States took place on July 12, 1940, in the Nez Perce National Forest in Idaho. Another smoke jumper, Rufus Robinson, went first. Then out came Earl Cooley. As he later described it, the plane was not much more than half a kilometer above the trees. The day was windy, and the jump was not as good as others he had made. He began to turn over in the air when his chute opened, and there were problems with the lines at first. But he chose a large spruce tree to land in near the fire and climbed down. With hand tools, he and Rufus Robinson threw dirt on the fire and dug a line to contain it so the flames would not spread. They worked through the night and had the fire controlled the next morning when other men arrived from a camp in the area. Earl Cooley always said he was not afraid being a smoke jumper. Over the years, he worked to develop the profession. He served as the first president of the National Smoke Jumper Association. He also wrote about his experiences. But not all had happy endings. On August 5, 1949, he was involved in a disaster at a forest fire near Helena, Montana. He had to choose where a crew would jump, but the wind changed and the fire grew unexpectedly, taking 13 lives. Many years later, Earl Cooley told a newspaper that he still believed he had made the best decision he could. He retired from the Forest Service in 1975. But he continued to visit the mountain where the men lost their lives until he could no longer make the climb. Earl Cooley died on November 9th in Missoula, Montana. He was 98 years old. Today, more than 270 men and women are smoke jumpers for the Forest Service. Smoke jumpers are also used in Russia and other countries. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report in Special English. IKEA recently recalled frozen meatballs from its European stores after tests found some contained horse meat. Czech investigators said they found small amounts of horse meat in Swedish meatballs at an IKEA store in the Czech Republic. IKEA is the big Swedish company that sells furniture, but its stores also sell Swedish foods. The packaging said the meatballs contained beef and pork. IKEA said meatballs from the contaminated batch were sent to stores in some other European countries. They included Belgium, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, and the Netherlands. Recently, laboratory tests found horse meat being sold as beef in a number of European Union countries. The EU law enforcement agency, Europol, is investigating the meat industry. Owen Patterson is the British Environment Secretary. He says the sale of horse meat as beef is unacceptable. He called it a fraud on the public. Millions of food items have been removed from stores, schools, and hospitals. No one has reported any health problems, and the French eat horse meat. But the situation has upset consumers across Europe. In Britain, horse meat was discovered in frozen meals sold by the Swedish-based frozen food company Findus. In France, an investigation has accused the French meat processing company Spanghero of knowingly selling horse meat as beef. The company denies the accusation. The EU requires the packaging of fresh meat to identify the country where it was produced. But in prepared meals, only the kind of meat used is required to be listed. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Pastoralism remains a way of life in East Africa. Herders travel from place to place in the dry, dusty deserts to find food and water for their animals. But some people think this movement of livestock is bad for the environment. They say pastoralists should settle on farms and grow their own food, especially in times of shortages. Not everyone agrees. Experts recently met in Nairobi to discuss what to do about food shortages caused by drought. They say pastoralists make the best use of resources. David Wangi at the Kenya Agricultural Research Institute says grasslands have time to recover. He says pastoralists have to leave an area as soon as the water is exhausted. They move to the next area that has water. It gives the area they left time to regenerate before they come back. Mr. Wangi says the land used for animals is often not good enough for farming, especially during droughts. He and other experts say pastoralism makes the most sense for dry and semi-dry lands. Jeff Hill directs policy for the Bureau of Food Aid at the United States Agency for International Development. He says arid and semi-arid lands represent about 80% of the Horn of Africa. Livestock-based economies in these areas provide up to 40% of agricultural production in Ethiopia and 50% in Kenya. And in Somalia, Mr. Hill says the percentage is even higher. In Somalia, livestock systems fuel the economy. An estimated 90% of the meat eaten in East Africa comes from pastoralist herds. Mr. Hill says Kenya and other governments have only recently recognized the value of arid and semi-arid lands. These lands have often been excluded from government planning and road building. Herders can face limited access to grazing and watering areas. Researcher David Wangi says communities need to be creative with the resources they have. He says a good example is a project in Kenya in which grass is grown in the desert to feed livestock. What would happen if we developed a system where we grow fodder and pasture along the river and the animals are taken off from the range and finished nearer to the market? What we need is a system, and that is what has been really lacking. He also says more efforts need to be put into raising camels. Camels are often the only animals that produce milk during a drought. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. East Africa's drought is the worst in 60 years. Scientists say the dry conditions in the Horn of Africa are at least partly the result of an event half a world away. The event is called La Niña, which means little girl in Spanish. A La Niña begins when waters become cooler than normal in the eastern Pacific Ocean near the equator. Changes in wind currents can then affect weather around the world. A related event, called an El Niño, happens when the waters become unusually warm. La Niñas and El Niños happen about every 3 to 5 years. The latest La Niña began in July of last year and ended in May. The conditions can last for up to 2 years. Wasila Tiao studies Africa for the Climate Prediction Center at the National Weather Service in the United States. With the La Niña, Mr. Tiao says the easterly winds that are supposed to bring moisture into East Africa are reduced. And when that happens, rainfall is reduced. Starting late last year, rains that were supposed to fall over Somalia, southern Ethiopia, and northern Kenya failed. That part of the Horn of Africa has a second rainy season during March, April, and May. Mr. Tiao says that one failed too, but probably mostly due to the atmospheric conditions that prevailed at that time. He says La Niña conditions might begin again by the end of this year. And if that happens, he says then the October through December rainy season could again be drier than normal. Climate researcher Simon Mason at Columbia University in New York says East Africa has been getting drier over about the last 10 years. Mr. Mason says this is at least partly the result of global warming. Rising temperatures in the Indian Ocean create conditions that pull moisture away from East Africa. Claudia Ringler at the International Food Policy Research Institute also points to another issue. She said much of the land in the drought-affected areas is not very productive, even in good times. It will not get any better. Even if we have a bit more rainfall, the general potential for more food production is not expected to improve dramatically in the region. In the United States, the latest La Niña pushed moisture away from the south, causing severe droughts. Texas has suffered billions of dollars in agricultural losses. Changes in the winds pushed the rain toward northern states, causing floods. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. You can learn English and stay informed every day at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report. Some countries have suspended imports of wheat from the United States. The suspensions were announced after an unapproved form of wheat was found in the state of Oregon. The crop was genetically engineered. An Oregon farmer recently discovered wheat in his field that survived the popular weed killer Roundup. Roundup is made by the seed and chemical company Monsanto to destroy unwanted plants. The company has created genetically engineered corn, cotton, soybean, and canola crops that resist Roundup. Monsanto field-tested Roundup-resistant wheat, but it never sold the seeds. Michael Furco is with the United States Department of Agriculture. He says the wheat passed safety inspections. Monsanto ended its wheat project because buyers in Europe and Asia were concerned about the safety of genetically engineered crops. The discovery of unapproved wheat in Oregon led Japan and South Korea to temporarily suspend some imports. The United States is the world's largest wheat exporter, but American agriculture has difficulty competing against other countries because production costs are higher in the United States. Mark Welch is an agricultural economist at Texas A&M University. He says the incident could affect America's place in the world market. United States officials are working to identify the source of the genetically engineered wheat. There is no evidence yet that it has entered the food supply. The Department of Agriculture is working to make tests available to wheat buyers. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. About 800 million people in Africa, Asia, and South America eat cassava. The plant is a major source of food energy and a major food security crop. It can survive in poor soil and without much water. Also, the root can stay in the ground for as long as 3 years, so it can be harvested as needed. But in East Africa, the plant is under attack. Cassava brown streak disease is a more destructive form of cassava mosaic. The mosaic has been active in East Africa for about 100 years. It limits plant growth, but brown streak can destroy a crop. The virus was identified in Uganda in 2004 and has spread fast in areas extending from Lake Victoria. So far, brown streak has not jumped to Nigeria, the world's largest producer of cassava. But it threatens more than 30 million tons a year of production in East Africa. In some areas of Uganda, rates of brown streak reached more than 85% in 2005 and 2008. Claude Fouquet is a scientist at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center in St. Louis, Missouri. He says a few varieties of cassava can resist brown streak, but these are not the kinds Africans like. He is working to develop disease-resistant plants, but he says it will probably take 5 years. Loss of cassava crops could lead to hunger, and hunger can lead to migration and conflict. About $50 million is coming from the Gates Foundation, the Monsanto Fund, and the United States Agency for International Development. But Claude Fouquet says much more is needed to fight the disease. Brown streak can be hard to identify in the field. Irregular yellow spots may appear on lower leaves, but farmers sometimes do not find the disease until they cut open a cassava. If there is only a small amount of rot, the dead material can be cut away. But if the disease has progressed, the whole root is ruined. Scientists partly blame whiteflies for spreading the disease from plant to plant. Brown streak also spreads if farmers sell or give away cuttings of infected plants. Cassava has many food uses, but the plant is not safe to eat unless it is specially prepared. It must be processed through methods like boiling, grinding, or fermenting. A substance that can produce deadly levels of cyanide when eaten must be removed. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report.
This is the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. Pigweed is a weed that spreads fast and grows up to 2 meters tall. It can overpower cotton and other crops. It comes from the amaranth family and is also known as Palmer amaranth, or Palmer's pigweed. A cultivated version of amaranth is grown for food and medicine in Africa and Asia. In the United States, some people buy amaranth as a gluten-free substitute for wheat flour. But wild pigweed is a big problem in cotton-growing states in the South. And now the plant is spreading into the Midwest. In many cases, the pigweed is killing genetically modified cotton and soybeans. For years, farmers could control it by spraying with Roundup or glyphosate, made by Monsanto. But weed scientist William Curran at Pennsylvania State University says over the past 3 or 4 years, pigweed has become resistant to glyphosate. Now, farmers in some areas can no longer depend on that popular herbicide alone to defend against pigweed. He says farmers can try other herbicides, or they can mix another herbicide with Roundup and use the mixture when they would normally spray their fields. The reality is, even though we have this weed, this one weed that is resistant, there's still a lot of other weeds that Roundup still kills. Farmers in the American Northeast face a growing threat from another weed. Scientists call it horseweed. Farmers call it mare's tail. Like pigweed, this plant has also developed the ability to resist glyphosate. Professor Curran sees one major reason for this. Farmers are depending too much on individual products and not enough on different strategies to manage weeds. The question, he says, is how best to use a system of integrated pest management to control weeds. For example, IPM calls for farmers to rotate their crops instead of planting the same ones in the same soil year after year. Professor Curran says farmers should also consider planting cover crops. These crops are grown temporarily to protect the soil. For instance, planting rye in the fall can suppress horseweed. If you have winter rye out there occupying that space, it's very competitive, and the horseweed is less successful in establishing. In the next 2 or 3 years, Several companies expect to have new herbicides, along with crops that can survive spraying with those chemicals. And that's the VOA Special English Agriculture Report. If you have a farm, tell us how you manage weeds. Share your comments at voaspecialenglish.com. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Prasuti.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Agriculture Report. The United States Congress has been debating a new farm bill. This is a huge 5-year plan that includes support programs for American farmers. Government payments make up 8% of the income of farmers growing such major crops as maize, wheat, soybeans, cotton, and peanuts. That 8% is one of the lowest levels of support among developed countries. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says the average among its members is 20%. One reason for the low payments is high global crop prices. The price supports or subsidies that pay farmers when prices are low have not been used very much recently. Grain prices are high. Farmers have earned record or near record profits in the past few years. But they still receive about $5 billion every year in what are called direct payments. These payments go to farmers whether crop prices are high or low. Farmers do not even have to grow a crop to get direct payments. Now, Congress wants to cut between $20 and $40 billion from farm subsidies. Even the largest farmers group, the American Farm Bureau Federation, expects that direct payments will end soon. Mary Kay Thatcher is the chief lobbyist for the group. She says the payments are hard to justify politically, but there are proposals to increase subsidies once crop prices go down again. One version would let farmers receive payments with higher market prices. Another would protect a farmer's total income when prices fall. David Orden is an economist with the International Food Policy Institute. He says both versions would anger farmers in other countries. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.